The stone walls of Ravencrest Castle had witnessed many cruelties over the centuries, but none quite so persistent as the one that occurred each dawn in the Forgotten Tower's highest chamber. As the first light of morning crept through the single narrow window, Lorelei pressed her face against the cold iron bars, watching the world below come alive, a world that had deemed her unworthy of joining. 20 years had passed since her birth, 20 years of imprisonment in this circular room barely large enough for a bed, a wash basin, and the single wooden chair where she spent her days. The tower room was her entire universe, her gilded cage, though there was precious little gold about it. The walls were gray stone, perpetually damp and cold, and the only warmth came from a small brazier that servants reluctantly tended twice daily. Below in the courtyard, she could see her twin sister Seraphina gliding across the cobblestones like a vision from the heavens themselves. Even from this distance, Sarah's beauty was unmistakable. Golden hair that caught sunlight and transformed it into liquid starlight, skin like fresh cream, and a graceful bearing that made every movement seem choreographed by the gods. Sarah wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her azure eyes, the fabric flowing around her like water as she moved between the gathered nobles who had come to witness today's momentous occasion, the marriage contract signing, the event that would bind Seraphina to King Aldrich of the neighboring realm of Shadowmere, cementing an alliance that would bring unprecedented power to the kingdom of Astroleth. And Lorelei, the forgotten twin, would watch it all from her tower prison as she had watched every significant moment of her sister's celebrated life. She pressed her palm against the glass, leaving a foggy print that would fade within moments, just as her own existence seemed to fade from everyone's memory. The irony wasn't lost on her. Identical twins, born mere minutes apart, yet treated as though they belonged to entirely different species. She bears the mark, her mother Queen Celestine had whispered to the court physician on the day of their birth, and those 4 words had sealed Lorelei's fate. The mark, a crescent-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder, dark as a moonless night, had been declared an omen by the court's ancient seer. The shadow twin, the prophecy called her, will bring ruin to the crown if she walks in the light. She must remain hidden, for her very presence threatens the golden heir's destiny. 20 years of hiding, 20 years of being told she was cursed, dangerous, worthless. 20 years of watching Seraphina receive every advantage, every opportunity, every scrap of love and attention that should have been shared between them. A sharp knock echoed through the chamber, causing Lorelei to step back from the window. The heavy wooden door creaked open to reveal Martha, the elderly servant who had been her only consistent human contact for most of her life. Martha's weathered face bore deep lines of perpetual worry, and her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her austere black dress. "Come away from the window, child," Martha said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades spent as jailer and reluctant caretaker. "You know your parents have forbidden you to be seen during the ceremony." "And what if I am seen?" Lorelei asked, though she moved away from the window as requested. Her voice carried a bitterness that had grown stronger with each passing year. What terrible catastrophe would befall the kingdom if someone glimpsed the shadow twin? Martha's expression softened slightly. In all these years, she had been the only one to show Lorelei even a measure of kindness, though it was always tempered by a fear of discovery. "You know I cannot answer such questions, my lady. I've brought your morning meal." This tray Martha set on the small table contained the same sparse offerings as always. A bowl of thin porridge, a crust of bread, and water. Below in the great hall, Seraphina would be dining on delicacies imported from across the known world, but the shadow twin merited only the most basic sustenance. "Tell me about the ceremony," Lorelei said as she sat at the table, though she made no move to eat. Food had lost much of its appeal when it served only to sustain an existence she increasingly questioned the value of. Martha hesitated, wringing her hands. "My lady, you know such talk is forbidden." "By whom? By parents who pretend I don't exist? By a kingdom that would rather believe their princess was born alone?" Lorelei's voice rose, years of suppressed anger bleeding through. "I am not dead, Martha, though they wish I were. I deserve to know what happens in the world beyond these walls." The older woman glanced nervously toward the door, then moved closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "King Aldrich arrived this morning with a retinue of 50 knights. They say he's imposing, taller than any man in our court, with shoulders broad as a blacksmith's anvil. His hair is dark as a raven's wing, and his eyes, she shuddered slightly. They say his eyes are silver, like moonlight on steel, and that he can see straight into a person's soul. Despite herself, Lirelei felt a flutter of curiosity. She had heard whispers of the Alpha King over the years. Aldrich Thornwick, ruler of Shadowmere, a man who had united 7 warring territories under his iron fist by the age of 25. The stories painted him as equal parts savior and destroyer, beloved by his people, yet feared by his enemies. Cruel, she asked. The servants from his retinue speak well of him, Martha admitted reluctantly. They say he's demanding but fair, quick to anger but quicker to justice. But child, why do you torment yourself with such thoughts? This marriage has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with her. The words stung because they were so undeniably true. Seraphina's marriage, like everything else of importance in the kingdom, would proceed without the slightest consideration for the existence of a twin sister locked away in a tower. Lirelei was less than a ghost. She was a deliberate absence, a person-shaped hole in the royal family. "Leave me," she said quietly, pushing the untouched porridge away. "I wish to be alone." Martha hesitated for a moment longer, her maternal instincts warring with her sense of duty. Finally, she nodded and gathered up the tray. "The ceremony begins at noon, my lady. Please, for all our sakes, stay away from the window during that time." When the door closed behind Martha, Lirelei was once again alone with her thoughts and the distant sounds of celebration drifting up from the courtyard below. She moved to her small collection of books, the only luxury she had been granted, and only because Queen Celestine believed that an educated prisoner was a more manageable one. The volumes were worn from countless readings, ancient histories, philosophical treatises, and a single book of poetry that she treasured above all others. She opened the poetry collection to a page marked with a pressed flower, a violet that Seraphina had dropped outside the tower window years ago, the only gift Lirelei had ever received from her twin. Even if it hadn't been intentional, the poem on the marked page spoke of hidden worth, of diamonds buried beneath layers of coal and earth, waiting for someone with the vision to see their true nature. "The shadow holds what light cannot reveal," she read aloud, her voice echoing in the small chamber. "In darkness grows the truest beauty real." As the morning hours crept toward noon, the sounds from below grew increasingly festive. Musicians played fanfares that echoed off the castle walls, and the cheers of gathered subjects created a constant din of celebration. Lirelei found herself drawn back to the window, despite Martha's warnings, pressed against the glass like a moth drawn to flame. The courtyard was now filled with hundreds of people, nobles in their finest silks and velvets, knights in polished armor, servants and townsfolk granted permission to witness this historic union. At the center of it all stood a raised dais draped in royal purple and gold, where 2 ornate chairs waited for the bride and groom. Seraphina appeared first, escorted by their father, King Aldwin. Even from her distant perch, Lirelei could see that her sister was radiant, practically glowing with happiness and anticipation. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of white silk and silver thread, adorned with pearls that caught the noon sun and threw it back in brilliant flashes. A crown of white gold and diamonds rested atop Sarah's golden curls, a crown that should have been shared between twins, had fate been kinder. Then the crowd's cheers reached a thunderous crescendo, and King Aldrich himself strode into view. Martha's description had not done him justice. The Alpha King moved through the assembled masses like a force of nature, his very presence seeming to bend the world around him. He stood nearly a head taller than the tallest of his knights, his broad frame wrapped in midnight black leather and steel that spoke of both wealth and practicality. A cloak of deep gray wool billowed behind him, held at his throat by a silver brooch shaped like a snarling wolf. But it was his face that truly captured Lirelei's attention, angular and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of royal bloodlines stretching back generations. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, touching his shoulders in waves that he made no attempt to tame. And his eyes, Martha had been right about his eyes. Even from her tower prison, Lirelei could see the unusual silver hue, like polished steel or winter starlight. Those eyes swept across the crowd with the predatory focus of a wolf surveying his territory. This was a man accustomed to command, to having his every word obeyed without question. Yet there was something else in his bearing, something Lirelei couldn't quite identify. A tension, perhaps, or a sense of searching for something that remained eternally just out of reach. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur befitting the union of two royal houses. Vows were exchanged in voices that carried across the courtyard, witnessed by hundreds of subjects and sealed with the ancient rituals of alliance and marriage. King Aldric's voice was a deep baritone that seemed to resonate in Lirelei's very bones, while Seraphina's responses were clear and melodious, every word perfectly enunciated. But as the ceremony reached its climax, something unexpected happened. King Aldric's silver gaze swept upward, scanning the castle's towers and battlements with the same systematic thoroughness with which he had surveyed the crowd below. His eyes moved from window to window, from spire to spire, and then, impossibly, incredibly, they found hers. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Alpha King stared directly up at Lirelei's tower window. The distance was too great for her to read his expression clearly, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, pressing against her through the glass and iron bars. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she felt an inexplicable urge to step back into the shadows where she belonged. But she didn't step back. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, pressing closer to the glass, held captive by those silver eyes that seemed to see straight through stone and metal to the forgotten princess hidden within. The moment shattered when Seraphina's voice rose in joyful laughter at something their father had whispered in her ear. King Aldric's attention snapped back to his bride, the spell broken as suddenly as it had formed. The ceremony continued, vows were completed, and the crowd exploded into celebration once more. But Lirelei remained frozen at her window, her heart racing with an emotion she couldn't name. Had he truly seen her? Or had it been merely coincidence, his gaze passing over her tower in its systematic sweep? He saw me, her mind whispered with a certainty that defied logic. He saw me, and he didn't look away. The implications were staggering. In 20 years, no one aside from Martha and the handful of servants sworn to secrecy had so much as acknowledged her existence. She had become skilled at reading the subtle signs when someone accidentally glimpsed her at the window. The quick averting of eyes, the uncomfortable shifting, the desperate pretense that they had seen nothing at all. But King Aldric hadn't looked away. He hadn't averted his gaze or pretended she didn't exist. For those few heartbeats, he had stared directly at her with an intensity that suggested not just recognition, but interest. The celebration below continued late into the afternoon, with music and dancing and feasting that would likely stretch well into the night. Through her window, Lirelei watched her sister dance with her new husband, watched the Alpha King navigate the complex social requirements of royal ceremony with practiced ease. He spoke with nobles and knights, accepted the congratulations of foreign diplomats, and played his part in the political theater with consummate skill. Yet several times throughout the afternoon, she caught those silver eyes turning upward again, seeking her window with a persistence that made her pulse quicken. Each time their gazes met across the impossible distance, she felt that same jolt of recognition, that same inexplicable sense of connection to a man she had never spoken to and likely never would. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the courtyard, the celebration began to move indoors. The newlyweds would retire to the Great Hall for a private feast, while their guests enjoyed entertainment and revelry in the lower chambers. Soon, the courtyard would be empty save for the guards, and Lirelei's brief window into the outside world would close once more. She was about to step back from the glass when a commotion near the castle's main entrance caught her attention. A small group of men in the black and silver colors of Shadowmere were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with several of her father's guards. At the center of the group stood King Aldric himself, his commanding presence making him instantly recognizable, even in the growing dusk. The conversation continued for several minutes, with gestures and pointing that suggested some kind of disagreement or confusion. Then, to Lirelei's amazement, she saw the Alpha King's head turn upward once more, his gaze finding her window with unerring accuracy. This time he raised one hand in what could only be described as a subtle acknowledgement, a gesture so brief that anyone not watching carefully would have missed it entirely. But Lorelei was watching, had been watching him with the desperate attention of someone starved for human connection, and she saw. He had acknowledged her. The Alpha King, newlywed to her twin sister, had looked up at a supposedly empty tower and deliberately acknowledged the existence of the shadow twin that the rest of the world pretended wasn't there. Her hands trembling, Lorelei pressed her palm against the glass in response, knowing he was too far away to see such a small gesture, but needing to make it anyway. For the first time in her 20 years of life, someone had seen her not as a mistake to be hidden, not as a curse to be contained, but simply as a person worthy of recognition. The group below seemed to reach some kind of resolution, and the men in Shadowmere colors dispersed toward various entrances of the castle. But King Aldrich remained for a moment longer, his silver gaze holding hers across the distance with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Then he turned and strode toward the main entrance, his dark cloak billowing behind him like shadow made manifest. Within moments, he had disappeared into the castle's interior, leaving Lorelei alone at her window, with her racing heart and 1,000 questions she had no way to answer. Why? The question echoed in her mind as she finally stepped back from the glass. Why would he acknowledge me? What could he possibly gain from recognizing the existence of a twin sister who brings nothing but shame to the royal family? As night fell over Ravencrest Castle, the sounds of celebration drifted up from the great hall below. Music and laughter, the clinking of goblets, and the cheerful chatter of guests who belonged to a world that had never had a place for her. But for the first time in years, Lorelei found herself less focused on what she was missing and more intrigued by the mystery of a silver-eyed king who had seen fit to acknowledge her existence. She moved to her small bed and lay down fully clothed, staring up at the stone ceiling, where shadows danced in the flickering light from her brazier. Sleep seemed impossible when her mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. But eventually exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into dreams filled with silver eyes and the phantom weight of recognition. She had no way of knowing that 3 floors below, King Aldrich sat in his assigned chambers, ignoring the festivities in favor of staring out his own window at the tower where he had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist according to every piece of intelligence his spies had gathered about the royal family of Astrolith. Twin daughters. The reports had mentioned twin daughters, though they had dismissed one as sickly and rarely seen. But the face he had glimpsed in that tower window had been anything but sickly. Beautiful, yes, with the same ethereal features as his new bride, but marked by something deeper. A melancholy and intelligence that spoke of years spent in contemplation and solitude. Who is she, he wondered, his strategic mind already working through the implications. And why is she hidden away like a shameful secret? 3 days had passed since the wedding ceremony, and Lorelei found herself unable to shake the memory of those silver eyes finding hers across the crowded courtyard. She had replayed the moment countless times, analyzing every detail, until she had almost convinced herself it had been nothing more than wishful thinking, born from 20 years of desperate loneliness. Almost. The castle had settled into the rhythm of hosting royal guests, though the Alpha King and his retinue were scheduled to depart within the week. From her tower window, Lorelei could observe the daily activities of the visiting knights as they trained in the courtyard, their black and silver armor gleaming in the autumn sunlight. They moved with a precision and discipline that spoke of years spent in actual combat rather than ceremonial displays, each man a weapon honed to deadly perfection. King Aldrich himself was a frequent presence during these training sessions, and Lorelei found herself drawn to the window whenever she heard the distinctive sound of steel on steel that signaled his participation. Watching him spar was like observing a master craftsman at work, every movement deliberate and economical, every strike calculated to maximum effect. He fought with a massive two-handed sword that would have been unwieldy in lesser hands, but under his control it moved like an extension of his own body. "You've been spending even more time at that window than usual," Martha observed as she brought the midday meal. The elderly servant's tone carried a note of concern that had grown more pronounced over the past few days. "It's not wise to draw attention to yourself, child." "What attention could I possibly draw?" Lorelei replied, though she didn't move away from the glass. Below, the Alpha King had just disarmed 2 opponents simultaneously, a feat that drew appreciative cheers from the watching crowd. I am invisible, remember? A shadow that exists only in darkness. Martha set the tray down with more force than necessary, the dishes clattering in obvious displeasure. Do not quote their cruel words back to me, my lady. I've spent 20 years watching what their poison has done to your spirit. The vehemence in Martha's voice was unusual enough to pull Liralay's attention from the window. The old woman's hands were clenched into fists, her weathered face flushed with an anger that she rarely allowed herself to display. Martha? Forgive me, my lady. The servant took a deep breath, visibly struggling to compose herself. It's just seeing you waste away in this tower, watching you accept their judgment as truth. It breaks an old woman's heart. Liralay moved away from the window and took Martha's trembling hands in her own. It was the first time in years that she had seen her caretaker show such raw emotion, and something about it stirred a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. You've been more than kind to me, she said softly. Without you, I would have gone mad years ago. Kind? Martha's laugh was bitter. Child, I've been your jailer as much as your protector. Every day I've brought you food and water and helped maintain the charade. I've been complicit in their cruelty. You had no choice. There is always a choice. The words burst out of Martha with 20 years of suppressed guilt behind them. I could have spoken up when you were a babe. I could have demanded they treat you fairly, or refused to participate in this imprisonment of an innocent child. Liralay squeezed the old woman's hands gently, and if you had, they would have dismissed you and found someone else to take your place. Someone who might not have shown me even the small kindnesses you have. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 2 decades hanging between them. Finally, Martha pulled her hands free and wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. There's something I must tell you, she said quietly. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was too much of a coward. A chill ran down Liralay's spine at the gravity in Martha's tone. What is it? The prophecy that sealed your fate. It wasn't as simple as they made it seem. Martha moved to the chamber's single chair and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. The seer spoke of 2 paths, not just one. The shadow twin would either bring ruin to the crown or salvation. Liralay felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What? They chose to believe the darker interpretation because it suited their purposes, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally unburdened herself of the secret she had carried for 20 years. Your mother already favored Serafina from the moment of birth. She was born first, screaming and demanding attention, while you came quietly, observing everything with those white, intelligent eyes. When the seer spoke her words, Queen Celestine heard only what confirmed her existing prejudice. But why would they? Liralay's voice trailed off as an understanding dawned. They were afraid. Terrified, Martha confirmed. You were identical in every way except for that birthmark. Yet even as infants, you showed different temperaments. Serafina was impulsive, demanding, quick to anger, traits that could be shaped and controlled. You were thoughtful, observant, curious about everything around you. They feared what you might become if allowed to grow and learn freely. The revelation hit Liralay like a physical blow. 20 years of imprisonment, 20 years of being told she was cursed and dangerous, all because her parents had been too cowardly to risk the possibility that she might outshine her sister. The prophecy mentioned salvation as well as ruin, she said slowly. What did it say exactly? Martha hesitated, then seemed to steelhear herself for complete honesty. The shadow twin shall either bring the crown to ruin through darkness embraced, or lift it to glory through trials faced. Her path is not written, but carved by choices made in the crucible of adversity. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Liralay was only beginning to understand. She had been imprisoned not because she was destined for evil, but because she represented the unknown, a variable that her parents couldn't control or predict. All these years, she whispered, I believed them. I believed I was cursed, that my very existence was a threat to the kingdom. Child, Martha said urgently, rising from her chair to grasp Liralay's shoulders, you are not cursed. You are not dangerous. You are a princess of royal blood who has been denied her birthright through fear, and prejudice, nothing more. Before Lirelai could respond, a sound echoed through the chamber that neither of them had ever heard before. The heavy tread of multiple boots on the narrow stone stairs leading to the tower room. Martha's face went white with terror, and she instinctively stepped in front of Lirelai as though to shield her from whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped outside the door, followed by a moment of silence that stretched taut with tension. Then came 3 measured knocks, neither urgent nor hesitant, but carrying an unmistakable authority. Who could it be? Martha whispered, her voice trembling. No one comes here except servants, and never unannounced. The knocks came again, patient but insistent. Lirelai felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the heavy wooden door that had been both barrier and boundary of her entire world. In 20 years, no one of importance had ever climbed those stairs. No one had ever knocked and waited for permission to enter. Open the door, Martha, she said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. My lady, I cannot. Open it. With obvious reluctance, Martha lifted the heavy iron bar that secured the door and pulled it open just wide enough to peer into the stairwell. Her gasp of shock was audible even from across the chamber. Your Majesty, she stammered, immediately dropping into a deep curtsy. This is most unexpected. Lirelai's blood turned to ice. Your Majesty, there were only 3 people in the castle who merited that address. Her father, her mother, and King Aldrich's deep baritone carried easily through the partially open door. I apologize for the intrusion, but I find myself in need of answers that have proven elusive through traditional channels. Your Majesty, I'm afraid I don't understand. May I enter? The question was phrased politely, but the underlying command was unmistakable. Martha looked back at Lirelai with panic-stricken eyes, silently begging for guidance in a situation for which 20 years of service had not prepared her. Lirelai straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. If the Alpha King had come seeking answers, she would not cower in the shadows like the shameful secret everyone believed her to be. Let him in, she said clearly, her voice carrying to the figure waiting in the stairwell. Martha hesitated for one more agonized moment, then stepped back and opened the door fully. King Aldrich had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, his imposing height making the already small chamber seem even more cramped. He was dressed more simply than he had been during the ceremony. Dark leather breeches, a white linen shirt open at the throat, and boots that showed signs of recent use. His long, dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and those distinctive silver eyes swept the room with the same systematic thoroughness Lirelai remembered from the courtyard. When his gaze finally settled on her, she felt that same jolt of recognition, that same inexplicable sense of connection that had marked their first moment of eye contact. Up close, the effect was magnified tenfold. His presence filled the small space like a force of nature barely contained, and she found herself understanding for the first time why men spoke of him in tones of equal parts reverence and fear. Your Majesty, she said, offering a curtsy that was probably rusty from disuse, but came back to her through years of childhood lessons she had thought forgotten. You honor us with your presence. Something flickered in those silver eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. Lady Lirelai, I presume. The sound of her name on his lips sent a shock through her system. She had expected him to be uncertain of her identity, to require confirmation or explanation. Instead, he spoke as though her existence was as natural and acknowledged as any other member of the royal family. You know who I am, she said, not quite making it a question. I make it my business to know everything about the kingdoms with which I form alliances, he replied, his gaze never leaving her face. Though I confess the intelligence I gathered proved incomplete. Martha had remained frozen near the door, her face cycling through expressions of terror, confusion, and something that might have been hope. King Aldrich glanced at her briefly, then back to Lirelai. Perhaps we might speak privately? Martha stays, Lirelai said immediately, surprising herself with her own firmness. She has been my only companion for 20 years. If you have questions about my existence, she deserves to hear the answers as much as I do. Another flicker in those silver eyes, this one definitely approval. As you wish. He moved further into the chamber, and Lirelai became acutely aware of how the small space forced them into closer proximity than would normally be proper. I came because I find myself puzzled by certain inconsistencies in what I was told about the royal family. What were you told? Lyralee asked, though she suspected she already knew. That King Aldwin and Queen Celestine had twin daughters, but that one was sickly and rarely seen in public due to a weak constitution. His eyes traveled over her slowly, taking in her obviously robust health and clear complexion. Yet the woman I see before me shows no signs of illness or infirmity. The illness is not of the body, Lyralee said quietly. According to the court, I suffer from a spiritual malady that makes my presence dangerous to the crown. Ah, King Aldrich nodded as though this explanation clarified something that had been troubling him. And this spiritual malady manifests how, exactly? There was something in his tone, a subtle skepticism that gave Lyralee courage to speak more freely than she ever had before. I bear a birthmark that was interpreted as a sign of dark prophecy. The court seer declared that I would bring ruin to the kingdom if I walked in the light of public attention. I see. And did this seer specify the nature of this ruin? Lyralee glanced at Martha, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The prophecy spoke of two possibilities, ruin or salvation. My parents chose to believe the former. Of course they did. The dry humor in his voice was unmistakable. And so you have spent 20 years imprisoned in this tower to prevent a catastrophe that exists only in interpretation. The casual way he dismissed the prophecy that had shaped her entire existence left Lyralee momentarily speechless. Here was a man whose very presence radiated power and authority, casually dismantling the justifications that had kept her locked away since birth. You don't believe in the prophecy? She managed. I believe in many things, Lady Lyralee. I believe in the power of bloodlines, in the weight of destiny, and in the reality of forces beyond mortal understanding. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried absolute conviction. But I also believe that fear makes cowards of even the bravest souls, and that power built on the suffering of innocence is ultimately hollow. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Lyralee was afraid to examine too closely. King Aldrich moved to the narrow window and looked out at the view she had contemplated for 20 years. Tell me about your education, he said without turning around. The abrupt change of subject left her struggling to keep up. My education? You speak with intelligence and poise. Someone taught you letters and numbers, history and philosophy. Who? Martha brought me books, Lyralee said, glancing at her companion with gratitude. I taught myself to read, and from there, she gestured at the small collection of volumes that represented her entire formal education. King Aldrich turned back to face her, and there was something new in his expression, a calculating look that made her pulse quicken with both fear and anticipation. Self-taught, he mused. Impressive. What languages do you read? The common tongue naturally, Old Valerian from the historical texts, some Draconic from the philosophical works. She hesitated, then added, in Shadowmere formal script, though I've had limited practice with that. His eyebrows rose slightly. Shadowmere formal script is not an easy language to master without instruction. I found a diplomatic correspondence in one of the history books, she admitted. The letter was translated, but the original script was preserved alongside it. I used it as a guide to work out the patterns. Remarkable. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see straight through to her soul. And what conclusions have you drawn from your studies about the nature of leadership and power? The question was so unexpected that Lyralee found herself answering before she could second-guess herself. That power without wisdom is tyranny, but wisdom without power is merely philosophy. True leadership requires both the strength to make difficult decisions and the judgment to know when those decisions are necessary. And justice? What role does justice play in effective rule? Justice is the foundation upon which all legitimate authority rests, she said without hesitation. A ruler who abandons justice in favor of expedience may achieve short-term gains, but ultimately undermines the very structure that supports their power. King Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those unsettling silver eyes. Finally, he nodded as though she had passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. Lady Lyralee, he said formally, I would like to make you an offer. Her heart stopped. An offer? I have need of someone with your particular combination of intelligence, education, and unique perspective on the nature of hidden truths. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of royal command. I am prepared to offer you sanctuary in Shadowmere, a position of honor in my court, and the opportunity to use your considerable abilities in service of something greater than the fears of small minds. The world tilted around Liralee as the magnitude of what he was suggesting hit her. Freedom, recognition, the chance to step out of the shadows and into a life she had never dared dream possible. Your Majesty, Martha gasped, speaking for the first time since his arrival. That surely you cannot mean. I mean exactly what I say, he replied without taking his eyes off Liralee. The lady has been grievously wronged by those who should have protected and cherished her. If she is willing, I would see that wrong corrected. But I'm married to your bride's sister, Liralee stammered, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what he was suggesting. The scandal, the political implications, will be my concern to manage, he said simply. The question is whether you have the courage to accept what I offer. Courage. The word echoed in the small chamber like a challenge thrown down by fate itself. For 20 years she had existed in the shadows, accepting the judgment of others as immutable truth. Now this silver-eyed king was offering her the chance to step into the light, to claim a place in the world that had always denied her existence. But at what cost? The alliance between their kingdoms, the marriage he had just entered into, the careful political balance that such unions were meant to maintain, all of it could be threatened by her acceptance of his offer. I need time to consider, she began. I leave for Shadowmere at dawn tomorrow, he interrupted gently. The decision, whatever it may be, must be made tonight. Tonight. The word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through every assumption she had ever held about her life and future. In a matter of hours, she would need to choose between the familiar misery of her tower prison and the terrifying uncertainty of freedom. King Aldrich moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her one final time. Lady Liralee, I want you to understand something clearly. This offer is not made out of pity or guilt, nor is it motivated by any desire to cause political disruption for its own sake. Then why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because in my experience, those who have suffered injustice often possess the clearest vision of what justice truly means. And because he hesitated, and for just a moment, the mask of royal authority slipped to reveal something more human underneath. Because I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me only what they think I want to hear. The idea of having someone at my court who values truth above convenience is appealing. With that, he was gone, leaving Liralee and Martha alone with the echoes of an offer that would change everything, if she had the courage to accept it. The silence stretched between them as the implications of King Aldrich's visit settled like dust in the afternoon light. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My lady, what will you do? Liralee moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard where her entire world had been contained for 20 years. Below, life continued as it always had, guards walking their posts, servants going about their duties, nobles engaged in the endless dance of court politics. None of them aware that in a tower high above, a forgotten princess was contemplating a choice that could reshape the very foundations of two kingdoms. I don't know, she admitted, but Martha, for the first time in my life, I actually have a choice to make. And as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Liralee found herself counting the hours until dawn, knowing that when morning came, she would either remain the shadow twin hidden away in her tower, or step into the light as someone entirely new. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as Liralee wrestled with the most momentous decision of her life. Martha had remained in the chamber long past her usual departure time, both women too unsettled by the day's revelations to pretend at normalcy. They spoke in whispers, as though King Aldrich's visit had somehow made the tower room less secure, less isolated from the political machinations of the world below. You must go, Martha said for the dozenth time, her weathered hands twisting anxiously in her lap. This chance will never come again, child, never. But the consequences, Liralee began, only to be cut off by Martha's surprisingly fierce interruption. What consequences could be worse than this? The old woman gestured around the sparse chamber that had served as prison for 2 decades. Worse than watching you waste away, watching your spirit dim year by year as you accept their poisonous judgment as truth. Liralee moved to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The castle below was settling into its evening rhythm, lights beginning to flicker in windows as servants prepared chambers for the night. Somewhere in those illuminated rooms, Seraphina was likely preparing for another evening as Queen Aldrich's bride, surrounded by luxury and attention that should have been shared between twins. If I leave, I become a political problem, she said quietly. The Alpha King's offer, however generous, could destabilize the very alliance his marriage was meant to secure. And if you stay, you remain a living ghost, a person erased from history by fear and prejudice. Martha rose from her chair and moved to stand beside Liralee at the window. Tell me, child, in all your studies of history and philosophy, have you ever read of a great deed accomplished by someone who chose safety over courage? The question struck at the heart of Liralee's internal struggle. Every hero in every tale she had consumed during her long years of isolation had faced a similar moment, a choice between the familiar and the unknown, between comfortable misery and uncertain possibility. But I'm not a hero, she whispered. I'm just a forgotten twin who has never even set foot outside this tower. You are a princess of royal blood who has spent 20 years educating herself in isolation, who has maintained her sanity and dignity despite treatment that would have broken lesser souls, Martha said firmly. If that does not make you a hero, then the word has no meaning. A soft knock at the chamber door made both women freeze. Martha's eyes went wide with panic. King Aldrich had specifically said he would depart at dawn, and full darkness had only just fallen. Who else would dare climb the forbidden stairs to the Shadow Twins' prison? The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Martha moved to the door with obvious reluctance and cracked it open just enough to peer into the stairwell. Princess Seraphina, she gasped, immediately dropping into a curtsy. Your Highness, this is most unexpected. Liralee felt her heart stop. In 20 years, her twin sister had never once climbed these stairs, had never so much as acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional inadvertent glance across the courtyard. What could possibly have brought her here now? May I enter? Seraphina's voice was softer than Liralee remembered, lacking the imperious tone she had developed in childhood. I would speak with my sister. My sister. The words hung in the air like a miracle Liralee had stopped believing could happen. Martha looked back at her with questioning eyes, and Liralee managed a nod despite the shock that had rendered her nearly speechless. The door opened fully and Seraphina stepped into the chamber. Even in the dim light from the brazier, she was radiant. Golden hair caught and held the flickering flames, transforming them into a living halo around features that were identical to Liralee's own, yet somehow completely different. Where Liralee's beauty had been tempered by years of solitude and contemplation, Seraphina's had been refined by constant attention and admiration until it seemed almost otherworldly. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that probably cost more than most families saw in a year, with sapphires at her throat and wrists that caught the firelight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Everything about her spoke of wealth, privilege, and the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to question one's place in the world. Yet as she looked around the sparse chamber, something shifted in her expression. The casual confidence faltered, replaced by something that might have been shame. So this is where you have lived all these years, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of emotion that Liralee couldn't identify. I never imagined it would be so. Small? Liralee suggested when her sister's words trailed off. Bare? Prison-like? Seraphina flinched as though the words had been physical blows. I was going to say lonely. The sisters stared at each other across the narrow chamber, 20 years of separation and silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Liralee found herself cataloging the differences that had developed during their years apart. The way Seraphina held herself with unconscious regality, the subtle makeup that enhanced her natural beauty, the expensive perfume that made the simple chamber smell of exotic flowers. "Why have you come?" Lorelei asked finally, when the silence had become too heavy to bear. "Because," Serafina took a shaky breath, and for just a moment, her carefully composed mask slipped to reveal something raw and vulnerable underneath. "Because my husband asked me about you." The words hit Lorelei like a physical blow. Of course, King Aldrich had spoken to his wife about the sister she had pretended didn't exist. Whatever game he was playing, whatever political maneuvering had motivated his visit to the tower, it naturally would have required Serafina's participation, or at least her knowledge. "What did you tell him?" Lorelei asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "The truth," Serafina said simply, "that I have a twin sister I've never spoken to, never acknowledged, never even thought about beyond the occasional moment of guilt when I glimpsed you at your window." The honesty was brutal in its simplicity. No pretty words or comfortable lies, just the stark admission of 20 years of willful blindness. Lorelei found herself oddly grateful for it. After a lifetime of being treated as though she didn't exist, there was something almost refreshing about having her sister acknowledge the deliberate nature of that erasure. "And what did he say to that?" she asked. "He asked me if I was content to be queen of a kingdom built on such foundations." Serafina moved further into the chamber, her silk gown rustling softly in the confined space. "He asked me if I thought our marriage could prosper when it was founded on the systematic oppression of an innocent." Lorelei blinked in surprise. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, it wasn't to learn that the Alpha King had been challenging his new bride on moral grounds. "And what did you answer?" "I told him that you were dangerous," Serafina said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That the prophecy declared you a threat to the crown, that keeping you hidden was necessary for the good of the kingdom. And he laughed. The memory clearly still stung, judging by the flush that colored Serafina's cheeks. He laughed and said that fear had made cowards of us all, that a kingdom too weak to face its own shadows was hardly worth ruling. The words were so similar to what King Aldrich had said during his visit that Lorelei felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Here was a man who seemed genuinely committed to the principles he espoused, even when they created complications for his own political position. "Is that what you are?" Serafina continued, studying her sister's face with desperate intensity. "Are you a threat to our family, to our kingdom, or are you just a person who has been grievously wronged?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications that neither sister was fully prepared to face. Lorelei found herself thinking of all the moments over the years when she had glimpsed Serafina from her window. Birthdays and celebrations, victories and defeats, the gradual transformation from child to woman to queen. How different would both their lives have been if they had grown up together, if fear hadn't driven a wedge between them before they were old enough to understand what they were losing. "I am what they made me," Lorelei said finally. 20 years of isolation and contempt have shaped me in ways that growing up in the light never could have. Whether that makes me dangerous or simply different, I cannot say." "Aldrich believes you could be valuable," Serafina said. "He thinks your unique perspective could be an asset to our kingdom." "Our kingdom?" Lorelei couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I have no kingdom, sister. I have 4 stone walls and a window that looks out on a world that pretends I don't exist." Serafina flinched again, and this time there was no mistaking the genuine pain in her expression. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, desperately sorry for what we've done to you." The apology landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through 20 years of accumulated hurt and anger. Lorelei found herself struggling to process the sincerity in her sister's voice, the obvious regret that colored every word. "Sorry doesn't give me back the years," she said quietly. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage of growing up believing I was cursed, worthless, dangerous." "No," Serafina agreed, "it doesn't. Nothing can undo what we've done. But perhaps," she hesitated, then seemed to gather her courage, "perhaps there might still be a way to move forward." "What do you mean?" "Aldrich has asked me to support his proposal," Serafina said, her words coming in a rush, as though she was afraid she might lose her nerve. He wants you to come to Shadowmere to take a position at his court. He believes you could serve as an advisor, someone whose judgment hasn't been compromised by the usual courtly influences. Liralee stared at her sister in amazement. And you agree with this? I I don't know, Serafina admitted. The political implications are staggering. The scandal of a king bringing his wife's hidden sister to court, of acknowledging someone who has officially never existed, it could undermine everything our marriage was meant to accomplish. Then why are you here? Why are you supporting his proposal if you understand the risks? Serafina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting around the sparse chamber that had been Liralee's entire world. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Because when I look at this place, when I think about you spending 20 years in this cell, I realize that the kingdom we're all so worried about protecting isn't worth protecting if it's built on such cruelty. The words hit Liralee with unexpected force. This was not the shallow, pampered princess she had imagined her sister to be. This was someone capable of genuine moral reflection. Someone who could look beyond her own interests to confront uncomfortable truths. You would risk your position, your marriage, your future for someone you've never even spoken to before tonight? Liralee asked. You're not just someone, Serafina said fiercely. You're my sister, my twin. Half of me has been missing for 20 years, and I was too selfish and cowardly to acknowledge it. The raw emotion in her sister's voice broke something loose in Liralee's chest. Some frozen place where she had buried all her longing for family, for connection, for the sister bond that should have been the foundation of her world. Tears she had refused to shed for years suddenly burned behind her eyes. Sarah, she whispered, using the childhood nickname she hadn't spoken aloud since they were children. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, Serafina continued, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. I know that from your perspective, I'm as guilty as our parents for what you've endured. But please, Lyra, please consider Aldrich's offer. Not for the kingdom, not for politics, but for yourself, for the life you deserve to live. Lyra, the diminutive of her name that only Serafina had ever used, back when they were too young to understand the poison that would eventually drive them apart. Hearing it now, spoken with such desperate sincerity, nearly undid her completely. The risks, she began, will be Aldrich's to manage, Serafina interrupted. He understands the political implications better than either of us, and he's still willing to take this step. That tells me something important about the kind of man I've married and the kind of king he intends to be. Martha, who had been silent throughout the sisters' conversation, finally spoke up from her position near the door. My lady, she said gently, perhaps this is the answer you have been searching for. Not just freedom, but family. Liralee looked between her sister and her lifelong companion, these two women who represented the only meaningful relationships of her life. Both were urging her toward the same choice, both willing to support her in taking a leap into the unknown. If I accept, she said slowly, if I go to Shadowmere, what happens to you, Martha? You've spent 20 years caring for me. I won't abandon you to face whatever consequences my departure might bring. Child, Martha said with a smile that was both serene and proud, if you think I would let you face this new life alone, you underestimate the stubbornness of an old woman who has already sacrificed too much to your family's politics. You would come with me. Try to stop me, Martha said firmly. You'll need someone who knows your history, someone who can help you navigate the complexities of court life. And besides, she added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, I'm curious to see what kind of kingdom produces a king brave enough to challenge prophecies and foolish enough to fall in love with justice. Fall in love with justice? Liralee repeated, caught by Martha's choice of words. Oh, child, Martha said with a knowing look, you may have spent 20 years in isolation, but you haven't spent them blind. I've seen how you watch him from the window, seen the way your entire being comes alive when he's in the courtyard below. And more importantly, I've seen how he looks up at this tower, searching for glimpses of someone he's only met once. Heat flooded Liralee's cheeks as she realized that her fascination with the Alpha King had been more obvious than she thought. But before she could protest, Serafina spoke up with surprising gentleness. He asked about you even before he came to the tower, she said. During our wedding feast, he kept glancing toward the windows, asking questions about the castle's layout, about which chambers were occupied. When I finally asked him directly what he was looking for, he said he had the strangest feeling that something important was missing from the celebration. Something important, Liralee repeated faintly. Someone important, Serafina corrected. He knew somehow that there was more to our family than what he'd been told. It was as though he could sense your presence even when everyone else was committed to pretending you didn't exist. The implications of this revelation sent Liralee's mind spinning. If King Aldrich had been aware of some lack, some missing piece, even before he learned of her existence, then his offer of sanctuary might be motivated by more than political calculation or moral principle. I need to think, she said, moving to the window where she had spent countless hours contemplating a world she thought she would never be part of. This is all happening so quickly, and the choice will change everything, Serafina finished. I know, but Lyra, sometimes change is the only path to healing. As if summoned by the weight of the decision hanging in the air, a new sound echoed from the stairwell. Boots on stone, but lighter this time, more careful. Martha moved to the door and opened it at the first soft knock. Your Majesty, she said, curtsying deeply, we were just planning a midnight escape, I hope, King Aldrich said as he entered the chamber. His eyes swept over the scene, the two sisters facing each other across 20 years of separation, Martha hovering near the door like a protective guardian, the emotional intensity that still crackled in the air between them. Aldrich, Serafina said, rising from her chair with obvious relief. I was just explaining that you support my offer to your sister, he finished, moving to stand beside his wife. And I'm grateful for it, though not surprised. One of the things that drew me to you was your capacity for moral courage when it matters most. He turned to Liralee, those silver eyes finding hers with the same unerring accuracy she remembered from the courtyard. Have you reached a decision, Lady Liralee? The question hung in the air, simple in its phrasing, but momentous in its implications. Around her, three people waited for an answer that would reshape not just her own life, but the delicate balance of power between two kingdoms. Liralee closed her eyes and thought of all the books she had read, all the heroes and heroines who had faced similar crossroads. Every one of them had chosen the unknown over the familiar, courage over comfort, possibility over certainty. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady and clear. I accept your offer, Your Majesty. I will come to Shadowmere. The words seemed to release something that had been held in tension for 20 years. Serafina let out a shaky breath that might have been relief or fear or both. Martha clasped her hands together as though in prayer. And King Aldrich smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction that transformed his austere features into something almost boyish. Then we leave at first light, he said. Martha, I trust you'll be accompanying your lady? You couldn't keep me away, Your Majesty, Martha replied with surprising tartness. Excellent. Serafina, I'll need you to handle the diplomatic aspects of this transition. A carefully worded announcement about discovering a previously unknown royal cousin. Perhaps someone rescued from years of illness and now recovered enough to serve at court. A cover story, Liralee said, understanding immediately. A necessary fiction, he agreed. The truth would create too many complications for everyone involved. This way, you get your freedom, the kingdom avoids scandal, and I get... He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. I get someone whose loyalty will be to truth rather than convenience. And if the truth eventually comes out, Serafina asked, if someone discovers the deception, then we'll face that challenge when it comes, King Aldrich said simply. But I found that most people see what they expect to see, believe what they want to believe. A recovered royal cousin is a much more comfortable story than a hidden twin sister liberated from 2 decades of imprisonment. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Liralee one final time. Abanu. Pack lightly, men, he advised. Where we're going, you'll have no need of the trappings of captivity. When he was gone, the 3 women stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just been decided. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice bright with an excitement Liralee had never heard before. Well then, my lady, she said, moving toward the small chest that held Lorelei's few possessions. It seems we have a new life to prepare for. As Martha began gathering the meager belongings that represented 20 years of existence, Lorelei found herself at the window one last time. Below, the castle courtyard lay quiet in the moonlight, the scene of so many observations and longings now about to become part of her past rather than her eternal present. Beside her, Serafina placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Are you frightened?" she asked softly. "Terrified," Lorelei admitted, "but also alive. For the first time in my life, I feel truly alive." "Good," Serafina said, squeezing her arm gently. "That's exactly how someone should feel when they're about to claim the life they were always meant to live." As dawn approached and the hour of departure drew near, Lorelei stood at the threshold of her tower prison for the last time. In a few hours, she would walk down those stone stairs and out into a world that had no idea she existed. She would leave behind the shadows that had defined her entire existence and step into a light so bright it terrified her. But as she thought of Silver Eyes and promises of justice, of a sister's tearful apology and an old woman's fierce loyalty, she realized that terror and anticipation were not opposites. They were two sides of the same coin, both necessary components of courage. The Shadow Twin was about to disappear forever. What would emerge in her place remained to be seen. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold as Lorelei descended the tower stairs for the first time in 20 years. Each step felt surreal, as though she were walking through a dream that might shatter at any moment and send her tumbling back to her circular prison. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth by centuries of use, and she found herself marveling at details she had never been able to see from her window. The way morning light filtered through arrow slits, the ancient tapestries that decorated the walls, the very sense of space and movement that had been denied to her for so long. Martha walked beside her, carrying a small leather satchel that contained the sum total of Lorelei's worldly possessions. The old woman's face was flushed with excitement and anxiety in equal measure, her weathered hands trembling slightly as they gripped the bag's handles. For her, too, this represented a leap into the unknown. After 20 years of predictable routine, she was about to embark on a journey to a foreign kingdom with no certainty of what awaited them there. "Are you certain about this, child?" Martha asked as they reached the bottom of the stairs and faced the heavy wooden door that led to the castle proper. "Once we step through that door, there will be no turning back." Lorelei placed her hand on the iron handle, feeling its cool weight against her palm. Beyond this threshold lay a world she had observed but never experienced. People who had never seen her face, corridors she had never walked. The magnitude of it all pressed against her chest like a physical weight. "I've been certain of nothing but misery for 20 years, she said quietly. "Perhaps it's time to be uncertain about something else." The door opened onto a corridor that stretched in both directions, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Lorelei had memorized the castle's layout from her studies, but seeing it firsthand was entirely different. The ceilings were higher than she had imagined, the passages wider, the very air alive with the subtle sounds and scents of a living, breathing fortress. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and Lorelei's heart leaped before she recognized King Aldrich's distinctive silhouette. He was dressed for travel in dark leather and wool, with a heavy cloak thrown over his shoulders and travel bags at his feet. In the torchlight, his silver eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire as he took in her appearance with obvious satisfaction. "Lady Lorelei," he said, offering a formal bow that somehow managed to convey both respect and welcome. "You look well." She glanced down at herself, suddenly conscious of her simple gray dress and the way 20 years of limited sunlight had left her skin paler than was fashionable. Compared to the rich fabrics and elaborate styling that court ladies typically displayed, she felt woefully inadequate. "I fear I'm hardly dressed for royal company, Your Majesty," she said, unable to keep a note of uncertainty from her voice. "You're dressed for freedom," he replied firmly. "Everything else can be addressed once we reach Shadowmere." Before she could respond, another figure emerged from the opposite end of the corridor. Serafina approached with swift, purposeful steps, her arms laden with packages wrapped in fine cloth. Her face was pale but determined, and when she reached them, she pressed the bundles into Lorelei's surprised hands. "Traveling clothes," she explained hurriedly, and some basic necessities. I I couldn't bear the thought of you arriving at Shadowmere with nothing but what you could carry from that terrible room. Lirelei felt tears prick at her eyes as she accepted the gifts. The packages were heavier than expected, and she could feel the quality of the fabrics through their wrappings. After 20 years of owning virtually nothing, the simple act of receiving presents felt overwhelming. Sarah, you didn't need to. Yes, I did, Serafina interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. I have 20 years of sisterly duties to make up for. Let me start with this small gesture. King Aldrich watched this exchange with interest, his silver gaze moving between the sisters with an expression that might have been approval. The horses are ready, he said gently when the moment had stretched long enough. We should depart while the castle is still quiet. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Serafina embraced both Lirelei and Martha with fierce intensity, extracting promises to write regularly and to take care of each other. King Aldrich's men appeared as though from nowhere, efficient and silent as they gathered the minimal luggage and prepared for departure. And then they were walking through corridors Lirelei had only imagined, past chambers she had tried to picture from her tower window, toward the main gates that had represented the boundary of her world for 2 decades. Each step took her further from the familiar prison of her past and closer to the uncertain promise of her future. The castle courtyard in the pre-dawn darkness was a revelation. The space that had seemed so distant from her tower window was actually vast, large enough to accommodate hundreds of people during ceremonies and celebrations. The cobblestones were worn smooth by countless feet, and the air carried the scents of horses, leather, and the lingering smoke from the previous night's torches. A small group of riders waited near the gates, perhaps a dozen men in the black and silver colors of Shadowmere. Their horses were magnificent beasts, clearly bred for both speed and endurance, with intelligent eyes and the kind of perfect conditioning that spoke of excellent care. At their head stood a mare of unusual beauty, coal-black with silver markings that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. She's yours, King Aldrich said, noticing Lirelei's fascination with the mare. Her name is Moonwhisper, and she has the gentlest temperament of any horse in my stable. I thought she would be appropriate for someone making their first journey into the world. Lirelei approached the mare with wonder, extending her hand for the animal to investigate. Moonwhisper sniffed delicately at her fingers, then nuzzled against her palm with obvious approval. The simple contact with another living being who showed her nothing but acceptance nearly undid her composure entirely. I've never ridden before, she admitted, embarrassed by this gap in what should have been basic noble education. Then today you learn, King Aldrich said simply. Duncan will ride beside you and provide instruction until you are comfortable. A grizzled knight with kind eyes and silver threading his dark beard stepped forward, offering a respectful bow. It would be my honor, my lady. Moonwhisper is patient with beginners, and the roads to Shadowmere are well maintained. You'll be riding confidently before we reach the border. Martha had been provided with a gentle gelding and a side saddle that would accommodate her advanced age and limited riding experience. The old woman looked simultaneously terrified and exhilarated as one of the knights helped her mount, her hands gripping the reins with determined intensity. Ready? King Aldrich asked, swinging onto his own mount with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Lirelei looked back at Ravencrest Castle one final time, her eyes finding the tower window that had framed her entire existence. In a few hours, servants would arrive with her breakfast to find the chamber empty, the bird finally flown from its cage. What would her parents think when they learned of her departure? Would they be relieved that their shameful secret had removed itself from their lives, or concerned about the political implications? I'm ready, she said, and meant it. The gates of Ravencrest opened before them like the mouth of destiny itself, revealing a road that stretched away into the growing dawn. As they rode through the entrance and into the world beyond, Lirelei felt 20 years of imprisonment fall away like discarded chains. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with scents she had never experienced: wild flowers, forest loam, the distant promise of streams and meadows. The road to Shadowmere wound through countryside that seemed painted by the gods themselves. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass, ancient forests where morning mist clung to the trees like ghostly veils, streams that sparkled with reflected sunlight as they meandered through valleys dotted with small villages. Everything was new. Everything was beautiful. Everything spoke of a world far larger and more wondrous than she had ever imagined. True to his word, Duncan proved to be an excellent instructor. Within the first hour, Liralee was sitting more confidently in her saddle, her natural balance and Moon Whisper's gentle nature combining to make riding feel almost instinctive. The mare seemed to sense her rider's inexperience and adjusted her gait accordingly, never pushing too hard or moving too quickly. King Aldrich rode at the head of their small column, his posture relaxed but alert. Every so often, his silver gaze would find hers across the distance between them, and she would feel that same jolt of connection that had marked their first encounter. But now there was something different in those looks, a satisfaction, perhaps, or the pleasure of someone watching a carefully laid plan come to fruition. As the morning wore on and they put more distance between themselves and Ravencrest, Liralee found herself relaxing into the rhythm of travel. The world was so much bigger than she had understood, so full of life and movement and possibility. Farmers worked in fields that stretched to the horizon. Children played in village squares that bustled with morning activity. Merchants traveled roads that connected kingdoms and cultures in an endless web of human enterprise. "It's overwhelming, isn't it?" Martha said during their first rest stop, settling beside Liralee on a fallen log near a babbling stream. After 20 years of four walls, all this space and movement. "It's magnificent," Liralee breathed, watching King Aldrich's men water the horses while maintaining their easy vigilance. "I never truly understood how small my world was until I saw how vast the real one is." "And this is just the beginning," Martha said with a smile. "Wait until you see Shadowmere's capital. They say it's a city of wonders, built into a mountainside and crowned with towers that scrape the very clouds." King Aldrich approached them during this rest, his expression more relaxed than she had yet seen it. Away from the political pressures of court, he seemed younger somehow, less burdened by the weight of crown and responsibility. "How are you finding your first taste of freedom, Lady Liralee?" he asked, settling on a nearby boulder with unconscious grace. "Intoxicating," she admitted, "and terrifying. I spent so many years watching the world from my window, but experiencing it is entirely different." "In what way?" She considered the question carefully, wanting to articulate the profound shift that had occurred in just a few hours of travel. From the tower, everything seemed distant and separate, like scenes painted on canvas. But being part of it, feeling the wind and smelling the earth and hearing the sounds of life all around, it makes me realize how much I've missed, how much I have yet to learn. King Aldrich nodded thoughtfully. That hunger for experience, that awareness of how much there is to discover, those are valuable traits in an advisor. Many people who have had easy access to the world take it for granted, lose their sense of wonder and curiosity. "Is that what I'm to be, an advisor?" "Among other things," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning she wasn't yet ready to explore. "But first, you need time to adjust, to learn about court life and politics and the particular challenges facing Shadowmere." "What sort of challenges?" His expression grew more serious, the weight of kingship settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak. "The usual ones that face any kingdom: trade disputes with neighboring realms, internal political factions that must be balanced, the constant pressure to maintain military strength while also fostering prosperity for our people." "And the unusual ones?" He smiled at her perceptiveness. "There are rumors of unrest in the eastern provinces, whispers of an old enemy stirring again after years of quiet. Nothing confirmed yet, but concerning enough to require careful attention." Liralee felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with fear. Here was the real world of politics and power, of decisions that affected thousands of lives and conflicts that could reshape entire kingdoms. After 20 years of theoretical study, she was about to be thrust into the practical application of everything she had learned. "Do you truly believe I can be useful in such matters?" she asked. "I have knowledge from books, but no practical experience with actual governance or diplomacy." "Lady Liralee," he said, his silver eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity, "you have spent 20 years observing without being observed, learning without being taught, thinking without being influenced by the assumptions and prejudices that corrupt most court advisors. That unique perspective is exactly what I need. The conviction in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't just tolerating her existence. They were actively valuing it, seeing her isolation and suffering as having created something useful rather than something shameful. They resumed their journey as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the landscape gradually changing as they moved from Astroleth's rolling farmland into the more rugged terrain that marked the approach to Shadowmere. The hills grew steeper, the forest denser, and the very air seemed to carry a different quality. Thinner, perhaps, or charged with some indefinable energy that made Lorelai's skin tingle with anticipation. As they crested a particularly high ridge, King Aldrich called for the column to halt. He gestured toward the vista that spread below them, his expression proud and possessive, in the way that only comes from deep love of place. Shadowmere, he said simply. The valley that stretched before them was like nothing Lorelei had ever imagined. Ancient mountains rose on all sides, their peaks crowned with snow despite the autumn season. Between them lay a realm that seemed to exist in multiple levels. Terraced farmland gave way to forests that climbed the mountain slopes, while higher still, the gleam of ice and stone spoke of peaks that challenged the very sky. But it was the city itself that took her breath away. Built into the side of the largest mountain, it rose in tiers and levels that followed the natural contours of the stone. Buildings of white marble and gray granite seemed to grow from the mountain itself, connected by bridges and walkways that spanned impossible distances. And at the very peak, a castle of such magnificent proportion and beauty that it seemed more like a work of art than a military fortification. "It's impossible," she whispered, unable to take her eyes from the sight. "It's like something from a fairy tale." "It's home," King Aldrich said, and the simple pride in his voice made her understand why his people would follow him anywhere. "And now it's your home as well." As they began the descent into the valley, Lorelei found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. This morning she had been a prisoner, a shadow, a person who officially didn't exist. Now she was riding toward a city of wonders, toward a new life filled with possibilities she had never dared imagine. But as the great city of Shadowmere grew larger before them, as the reality of her new situation began to sink in, she felt a flutter of fear beneath her excitement. She had spent 20 years preparing for a life she had never expected to live. Soon that preparation would be tested in ways she couldn't predict. The road wound down through terraced farms and past villages that seemed prosperous and well-maintained. The people they encountered offered respectful bows to their king, but their faces also showed genuine affection rather than mere duty. Children ran alongside their horses for short distances, laughing and calling out greetings that King Aldrich returned with obvious pleasure. This was a realm well-ruled, Lorelei realized. Whatever challenges Shadowmere faced, it was not the grinding poverty or oppression that marked kingdoms where rulers cared more for their own power than their people's welfare. As they drew closer to the city proper, the road became more crowded with merchants, travelers, and citizens going about their daily business. And here, for the first time, Lorelei encountered something she hadn't expected. Curious stares, whispered conversations, the weight of attention from strangers who had never seen her before. "They're wondering who you are," King Aldrich said, riding closer as he noticed her discomfort. "A new face in the king's party always generates interest. What will you tell them?" "The truth as far as it goes," he replied, "that you are Lady Lorelei, a distant cousin of Queen Seraphina, who has recovered from a long illness and will be joining our court. Simple, believable, and requiring no elaborate deception." As they passed through the city's outer gates and began the winding ascent toward the castle, Lorelei marveled at the engineering that had made such a place possible. The streets were carved into the mountain itself, wide enough for wagons but steep enough to provide natural defenses. Buildings rose on either side in terraces that maximized both space and sunlight, their architecture a blend of practical necessity and artistic beauty. And everywhere there was life. Markets bustled with activity, craftsmen worked at trades that filled the air with the sounds of hammers and wheels and looms. Children played in squares that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. This wasn't just a city, it was a living organism, a community that had grown organically over centuries to become something unique and wonderful. The castle gates opened before them with silent efficiency, revealing a courtyard that dwarfed even Ravencrest's impressive space. Here, the architecture was more military in nature. High walls, strategic positioning of defensive structures, the kind of fortification that could withstand a siege from any conceivable enemy. Yet even here, beauty hadn't been sacrificed for function. Gardens bloomed in protected alcoves. Fountains provided the soothing sound of running water. And the stonework itself was carved with decorative elements that spoke of master craftsmen. As they dismounted and prepared to enter the castle proper, Lirelei felt the weight of transition settling on her shoulders like a mantle. Behind her lay everything she had ever known, 20 years of imprisonment, but also 20 years of certainty about her place in the world. Ahead lay mysteries and challenges, opportunities and dangers, all the complex realities of a life lived in the full light of existence rather than hidden away in shadows. King Aldric appeared at her side as she stood looking up at the castle's soaring walls. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," she'd admitted, "but no regrets." "Good, he said, offering his arm with courtly grace. "Because your education in the ways of power and politics is about to begin in earnest. And Lady Lirelei?" "Yes, Your Majesty?" "Welcome to Shadowmere. Welcome to your new life." As they walked together toward the castle's main entrance, Lirelei felt destiny settling around her like a comfortable cloak. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tests awaited her in the complex world of court politics and royal power, she would face them with 20 years of hard-won wisdom and the fierce determination of someone who had been given a second chance at life itself. The Shadow Twin was gone forever. What had taken her place was something new, something untested, something potentially dangerous to all the comfortable assumptions that govern the world of kings and queens and the delicate balance of power between nations. Behind them, Martha followed with Duncan's assistance, her weathered face bright with excitement and wonder. And in the distance, a raven took flight from one of the castle's highest towers, soaring into the afternoon sky as though carrying news of momentous changes to kingdoms far and wide. The interior of Shadowmere's royal castle was a study in elegant power. As King Aldric led Lirelei through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, she found herself overwhelmed by the sheer scale and beauty of her new home. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadow above, while walls of polished stone were adorned with tapestries that depicted centuries of history in thread and dye. Ancient weapons hung alongside works of art, and everywhere the eye fell, there was evidence of a kingdom that valued both strength and culture in equal measure. "The residential wings are to the east," King Aldric explained as they walked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast spaces. "Your chambers have been prepared in the Tower of Stars. It offers privacy and excellent views of both the city and the valley beyond." Lirelei tried not to think about how her last experience with towers had shaped 2 decades of her life. As though reading her thoughts, King Aldric glanced at her with those perceptive silver eyes. "This tower is different," he said quietly. "No locks on the doors, no bars on the windows. You are free to come and go as you please, to explore every corner of this castle and the realm beyond it." The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. Freedom of movement, the basic right to walk through doors without permission. These were concepts so foreign to her experience that she found herself momentarily lightheaded with the magnitude of it. They climbed a spiraling staircase carved from what appeared to be a single massive stone, its steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Unlike the narrow, claustrophobic stairs of her prison tower, these were wide and graceful, with windows at regular intervals that offered glimpses of the kingdom spread below. As they ascended, the quality of light changed, becoming clearer and more brilliant with each level. "The Tower of Stars gets its name from the observatory at its peak," King Aldric continued, seeming to enjoy her obvious fascination with her surroundings. "Some of the kingdom's greatest scholars have studied there, mapping the movements of celestial bodies and seeking to understand the deeper patterns that govern our world." "Scholars," Lirelei repeated, and couldn't keep the longing from her voice. After 20 years of learning in isolation, the thought of actual teachers, of libraries and laboratories and discourse with other minds, was almost too wonderful to believe. "You'll meet them tomorrow," he promised. But tonight you should rest and allow yourself to adjust to your new circumstances. They reached a landing where tall double doors of dark wood stood open, revealing chambers that took Liralay's breath away. The main room was circular, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the kingdom. Rich tapestries in deep blues and silvers provided warmth and color, while a massive fireplace carved from white marble dominated one wall. Comfortable chairs and elegant tables were arranged to take advantage of both the views and the firelight, creating intimate spaces within the larger room. But it was the books that truly captured her attention. Shelves lined every available wall space, filled with volumes that represented more accumulated knowledge than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. Her fingers trembled as she approached the nearest shelf, reading titles that spoke of subjects she had only dreamed of studying. "I took the liberty of having some volumes selected based on your particular interests," King Aldrich said, watching her reaction with obvious satisfaction. "Philosophy, history, political theory, and some works on the practical applications of governance. Consider them a welcome gift." "Your Majesty, This is too generous," she managed, though she couldn't tear her eyes away from the intellectual treasure trove before her. "Knowledge is meant to be shared, Lady Lirelay. These books will serve their purpose far better in your hands than gathering dust in the royal library." A soft knock interrupted them, and Martha entered carrying a tea service on a silver tray. The old woman's eyes were bright with excitement as she took in their surroundings, and Lirelay could see that she too was overwhelmed by the magnitude of their changed circumstances. "Your chambers are just down the corridor, Martha," King Aldrich said kindly. "I trust they meet with your approval?" "More than generous, Your Majesty," Martha replied, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "I've never seen such fine accommodations, not even in the royal guest quarters at Ravencrest." "You've both endured 20 years of unnecessary hardship," he said simply. "It's time you experienced how life should be lived." As Martha busied herself with the tea, King Aldrich moved to stand before the largest of the windows, his silhouette outlined against the afternoon sky. From this angle, Lirelay could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of responsibility that he carried even in moments of apparent relaxation. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this? And please don't say it's simply about justice or the need for honest advisors. There's something more, something personal that motivates this kindness." He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if she had overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "When I was a boy, perhaps 8 years old, I discovered that my father kept prisoners in the dungeons beneath this castle. Political enemies, he said, traitors, who threatened the stability of the realm." He turned to face her, his silver eyes shadowed with old pain. "One day I found a way into the cells and discovered that among those traitors was a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, who had been imprisoned simply because her father had spoken against the king's policies." Lirelay felt her heart clench as she understood where this story was leading. "I tried to help her," he continued, "brought her food, water, books when I could manage it. But I was just a child myself, powerless against the machinery of royal authority. She died that winter, Buster, of illness and despair. And I promised myself that when I became king, no innocent would suffer such a fate under my rule." The raw honesty in his admission left Lirelay speechless. Here was the source of his commitment to justice, the personal wound that had shaped his entire approach to kingship. "When I saw you in that tower," he said, his gaze holding hers across the elegant chamber, "when I learned that you had spent 20 years imprisoned for no crime other than being born, it was as though that little girl was calling out to me again, demanding that I keep the promise I made in those dark dungeons." "I'm sorry," Lirelay whispered. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that." "Don't apologize for my choices or my pain," he said firmly, "but understand that helping you isn't just about political advantage or moral principle. It's about honoring the memory of someone who didn't deserve to die in darkness." The moment stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of injustice and loss. Finally, Martha cleared her throat delicately, reminding them of her presence with characteristic tact. "Your Majesty, Perhaps you would join us for tea, she offered. After such a long journey, we could all use a moment of quiet refreshment. Thank you, Martha, but I have duties that require my attention, he replied, the mask of royal composure settling back into place. Lady Lirelei, rest this evening and allow yourself to adjust. Tomorrow, your real education begins. When he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of leather and something indefinably masculine, Lirelei sank into one of the comfortable chairs and accepted the cup of tea Martha offered with trembling hands. Well, ma'am, Martha said, settling beside her with obvious satisfaction, I'd say we've landed in a good place, my lady. Have we? Lirelei asked, staring out at the kingdom spread below her windows. Or have we simply traded one form of imprisonment for another, more elegant one? Child, Martha said gently, when was the last time someone asked you what you thought, what you wanted, how you felt about anything? When was the last time anyone treated you as though your mind and your opinions mattered? The questions hit home with startling clarity. In just the few hours since leaving Ravencrest, King Aldrich had consulted her thoughts, valued her responses, treated her as an equal in conversation rather than a burden to be tolerated. You're right, she admitted. But Martha, what if I fail? What if 20 years of theoretical study haven't prepared me for the realities of court life and political maneuvering? What if I disappoint his faith in me? Then you'll learn from your mistakes and do better, Martha replied pragmatically. My lady, you've spent your entire life preparing for this moment, even if you didn't know it. Trust in your education, trust in your instincts, and most importantly, trust in yourself. As evening fell over Shadowmere, Lirelei explored her new quarters with growing wonder. Beyond the main chamber lay a bedroom that was larger than her entire tower prison, with a bed so soft and welcoming that she found herself almost afraid to touch it. A dressing room connected to a private bathing chamber, complete with running water and mirrors that reflected back an image she barely recognized. Herself, but somehow transformed by hope and possibility. The packages Seraphina had given her contained treasures beyond her imagining. Dresses of fine wool and silk in colors she had never worn, undergarments of the softest linen, a cloak lined with fur that felt like liquid warmth against her skin. There were jewels as well, nothing ostentatious, but elegant pieces that spoke of wealth and status. As she prepared for her first night in freedom, Lirelei found herself thinking about the day's revelations. King Aldrich's childhood trauma explained much about his character, but it also raised new questions. What other scars did he carry from his youth? What other injustices drove his commitment to reform and justice? And more troubling still, what did it mean for her that his interest in her was at least partially motivated by ghosts from his past? Was she truly valued for herself, or was she simply a symbol, a chance to right old wrongs through proxy? A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Martha entered carrying a dinner tray that made Lirelei's mouth water with its rich aromas. The kitchens wanted to welcome you properly, Martha explained, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. Roasted fowl with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables from the castle gardens, and a wine that the cook assured me is fit for royalty. As they shared the meal, Lirelei found herself marveling at flavors she had never experienced. The food at Ravencrest had been adequate but plain, designed to sustain life rather than provide pleasure. This meal was a celebration of culinary art, each dish prepared with care and seasoned with skills passed down through generations. Tomorrow you meet the court, Martha observed, watching Lirelei savor a bite of perfectly seasoned fowl. Are you nervous? Terrified, Lirelei admitted. These people have no reason to trust me or value my opinions. I'm a stranger claiming to be recovered from illness, with no political connections or family alliances to recommend me. Why should they listen to anything I have to say? Because the king values you, Martha said simply. And because, whether you realize it or not, you have advantages that most court advisors lack. Such as, you have no personal agenda beyond serving justice and truth. You owe no favors, hold no grudges, seek no personal advancement. In a world where everyone else is maneuvering for position and influence, your objectivity will be invaluable. The observation was insightful, but it also highlighted one of Lirelei's greatest fears. What happened when she inevitably developed her own opinions, her own preferences, her own emotional attachments to people and outcomes? How long could she remain the objective outsider King Aldrich needed her to be? As the evening wore on, Martha retired to her own chambers, leaving Lorelei alone with her thoughts and the magnificent view from her windows. The city below sparkled with thousands of lights, creating a constellation of human activity that stretched across the valley floor. It was beautiful but also overwhelming in its reminder of how many people's lives might be affected by the decisions made within these castle walls. She was standing at the largest window, wrapped in her new fur-lined cloak and watching the play of moonlight on the distant mountains, when another soft knock came at her door. Expecting Martha with some forgotten item, she opened it without thinking and found herself face to face with King Aldrich. He had changed from his travel clothes into more formal court attire, dark velvet doublet, fine wool hose, and a circlet of silver that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. The transformation emphasized his royal status while somehow making him seem more approachable, more human. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, "but I wanted to check on your comfort before retiring for the evening." "Everything is perfect, Your Majesty," she assured him, stepping back to allow him entry. "More than perfect. I keep expecting to wake up and find myself back in the tower." "That won't happen," he said with quiet certainty. "You're free, Lady Lorelei, free to choose your own path, free to speak your mind, free to become whatever you're capable of being." They moved to the seating area near the fireplace, where the dying flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. In this intimate setting, with the formal distance of their respective roles temporarily set aside, Lorelei found herself studying his face with new attention, the strong jawline that spoke of determination, the aristocratic nose that hinted at generations of royal breeding, the silver eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Tell me about your court," she said, settling into her chair with unconscious grace. "What sort of people will I be working with?" "A mixture of the brilliant and the mediocre, the ambitious and the content, the trustworthy and the duplicitous," he replied with dry humor. "In other words, much like any other royal court, though I flatter myself that we maintain higher standards than most." "And they'll accept me? A stranger with mysterious origins and no established credentials?" "They'll accept you because I will it," he said simply, "but earning their respect and trust that you'll have to accomplish on your own merits." "No pressure at all," she murmured, and was surprised when he laughed. "Lady Lorelei, you've survived 20 years of isolation that would have broken most people. You've educated yourself to a level that rivals the finest scholars in my kingdom. You've maintained your sanity, your dignity, and your moral compass, despite treatment that was nothing short of torture." His expression grew serious, intent. "I have absolute confidence in your ability to handle whatever challenges my court might present." The faith in his voice was both exhilarating and terrifying. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the magnetic presence that had marked their very first encounter. "What if you're wrong about me?" she asked quietly. "What if I'm not the person you think I am, not capable of the things you expect?" "Then I'll adjust my expectations," he said, leaning forward as well, until the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. "But I don't think I'm wrong, Lorelei. I think you're exactly who I've been searching for." The use of her name without formal title sent a shock through her system. In the flickering firelight, with his silver eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity, she felt something shift between them, some barrier dissolving, some new understanding taking shape. "Your Majesty," she began. "Aldrich," he corrected softly. "When we're alone like this, when we're speaking as equals rather than king and subject, use my name." "Aldrich," she repeated, and the word felt dangerous on her tongue, like a secret too precious to speak aloud. "I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever I become in this new life, I will never forget what you've done for me. You've given me everything: freedom, purpose, hope for a future I never dared imagine." "You don't owe me anything, Lorelei," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Your freedom isn't a debt to be repaid. It's a right that should never have been denied." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging in the air between them. Finally, Aldrich rose from his chair, the spell of intimacy breaking as he resumed his royal bearing. "I should let you rest," he said, though his eyes lingered on her face as though memorizing every detail. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, and you'll need all your strength to meet them." As he moved toward the door, Lorelei found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Aldrich?" The name felt even more dangerous the second time she used it. He paused, turning back to face her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, but most of all for seeing me when everyone else chose blindness." Something flickered in those silver eyes, gratitude perhaps, or recognition, or something deeper that she didn't dare name. "Sleep well, Lorelei," he said softly. "Tomorrow you begin to reclaim everything that was stolen from you." When he was gone, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the spectacular view of his kingdom, Lorelei found herself touching her lips as though she could still taste his name there. The magnitude of what had passed between them was both thrilling and terrifying. She was a woman with no experience of men beyond books and observation, and he was a king married to her sister, bound by political necessity and royal duty. Yet something had sparked between them tonight, some connection that transcended their respective roles and circumstances. As she prepared for bed in her magnificent chamber, as she lay down on sheets softer than anything she had ever imagined, Lorelei found herself wondering if freedom might prove even more complicated and dangerous than imprisonment had ever been. Outside her windows, the city of Shadowmere settled into the quiet rhythms of night, unaware that in the Tower of Stars, a woman was discovering that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build around our own hearts. And in the royal chambers far below, a king lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly his carefully planned political maneuver had transformed into something that threatened every assumption he held about duty, honor, and the proper boundaries between sovereign and subject. Tomorrow would bring the complexities of court life, the delicate dance of politics and power that would test every skill Lorelei had developed during her years of forced solitude. But tonight, in the space between sleep and waking, she allowed herself to dream of silver eyes and the dangerous possibility that her greatest adventure was only just beginning. The morning of Lorelei's first day at court dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the magnificent windows of her chamber in the Tower of Stars. She had awakened before dawn, too nervous and excited to sleep, and had spent the early hours reading from one of the philosophy texts Aldrich had given her, seeking wisdom from ancient minds to steady her own tumultuous thoughts. Martha arrived with breakfast and an expression of determined cheerfulness that didn't quite mask her own anxiety. "Today's the day, my lady," she said, setting down a tray laden with delicacies that still seemed impossibly luxurious after 20 years of thin porridge and bread crusts. "Are you ready to take your place in the world?" "I don't think anyone could be ready for such a thing," Lorelei replied, though she managed a smile as she accepted the cup of perfectly brewed tea Martha offered. "But I suppose readiness is less important than courage." "Wise words," came a familiar voice from the doorway. King Aldrich entered without ceremony, already dressed in the formal attire of court, deep blue velvet trimmed with silver, his circlet of office catching the morning light. Yet despite the royal regalia, Lorelei found herself remembering the man who had sat by her fireplace last night, speaking her name like a prayer. "Your Majesty," she said, rising to offer a respectful curtsy that felt strange after their intimate conversation the previous evening. "Today, in formal settings, it must be Your Majesty," he acknowledged, though his silver eyes held warmth that belied the formal address. "But I wanted to speak with you privately before you face the court." Martha, with the instinct of someone who had spent 20 years reading unspoken communications, quietly excused herself to arrange Lorelei's wardrobe for the day. When they were alone, Aldrich moved to the window that offered the best view of the kingdom spread below. "There are things you need to understand about my court," he began without preamble. "Political currents that run beneath the surface of every conversation, alliances and enmities that date back generations." "Tell me," Lorelei said, settling into her chair and giving him her complete attention. "My chief counselor is Lord Darius Blackthorne, a man of unquestionable loyalty but also inflexible traditionalism. He'll be suspicious of any newcomer, especially one whose background cannot be thoroughly verified." Aldrich turned from the window, his expression serious. "Then there's Lady Cordelia Ashworth, who serves as my spy master. She knows more secrets than anyone has a right to know, and she'll be particularly interested in discovering yours. A chill ran down Liralei's spine at the mention of a spy master. How long would it take someone skilled in uncovering hidden truths to see through the fiction of her recovered royal cousin identity? And the others? Sir Marcus Ironwood commands my armies. A good man, honorable, but he values strength above all else and may question what a sheltered cousin could contribute to military strategy. Aldrich began pacing, his movements reflecting the restless energy that seemed to mark all his moods. Lord Cassius Goldwine handles trade and treasury matters. He's brilliant with numbers, but tends to see people as assets to be managed rather than individuals with their own worth. They sound challenging, Lirelei said carefully. They're the best advisors I could assemble, Aldrich replied, but they're also products of a system that has never had to accommodate someone like you, someone whose value lies not in traditional credentials but in a completely different perspective on power and justice. Before Lirelei could respond, a commotion in the corridor outside caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and beneath it all, an undercurrent of urgency that spoke of crisis rather than routine business. Aldrich's expression sharpened immediately. "That's Sir Marcus," he said, moving toward the door. "Something's happened." This knight who burst into the chamber was tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair and scarred hands speaking of decades spent in service to the crown. His face was grim as he dropped to one knee before his king. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but urgent news has arrived from the eastern borders." "Rise, Marcus. What news?" "Lord Commander Thorne's patrol discovered evidence of large-scale military movement in the Darkwood region," Sir Marcus reported, his voice tight with controlled alarm. "Supply caches, recently used campsites, tracks indicating at least 200 mounted warriors moving through territory that should be empty wilderness." Aldrich's face went cold as winter stone. "The Shadow Legion?" "All signs point to their return, sire. After 5 years of silence, it appears Malachar the Black has begun mobilizing again." The name hit the chamber like a physical blow. Even Lirelei, isolated as she had been, had heard whispers of Malachar, the exiled sorcerer king who had once carved a path of destruction across 3 kingdoms before being driven into the wasteland by a coalition of forces that had included Shadowmere. "How certain are we?" Aldrich asked, his strategic mind clearly already working through implications and responses. "The tracks are fresh, the camps were abandoned less than a week ago, and—" Sir Marcus hesitated, glancing uncomfortably at Lirelei's presence. "Speak freely, Marcus. Lady Lirelei is now part of my inner circle. She needs to understand the threats facing this kingdom." The casual way Aldrich included her in such sensitive matters sent a thrill through Lirelei's chest, but she forced herself to focus on the gravity of the situation. "There were signs of dark magic, sire. The local vegetation around the campsites has withered and died, and several of our scouts reported feeling watched by things that cast no shadow." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes distant as he processed this information. Finally, he nodded grimly. "Summon the full council for an emergency session. I want everyone in the war room within the hour. Lord Darius, Lady Cordelia, Lord Cassius, yourself, and—" He paused, his gaze finding Lirelei's. "Lady Lirelei will join us as well." Sir Marcus's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly, but his training was too complete to allow him to question his king's orders. "As you command, sire." When the knight had departed to carry out his orders, Lirelei found herself alone with Aldrich once more. But the intimate atmosphere of the previous evening had been replaced by the cold realities of kingship and the threat of war. "I'm to join the council meeting?" she asked, hardly able to believe what she had heard. "You wanted to serve as an advisor," Aldrich replied, his tone businesslike despite the warmth that still lingered in his eyes when he looked at her. "This is what that means. Being present for the decisions that could determine the fate of thousands of lives." The magnitude of it hit her like a physical blow. Yesterday, she had been a prisoner who officially didn't exist. Now she was being asked to help plan responses to threats that could reshape entire kingdoms. "I don't know anything about military strategy or magical warfare," she protested. "What could I possibly contribute to such a discussion?" "You'll listen, You'll observe, and you'll ask questions that others might not think to ask, he said firmly. Fresh perspectives often reveal solutions that experience has made invisible. Before she could respond, Martha returned with an armload of clothing that clearly represented her finest selection from Serafina's gifts. The deep green wool dress was cut in the latest court fashion, with silver embroidery that caught the light beautifully. It was elegant without being ostentatious, authoritative without being aggressive, perfect for a woman who needed to establish her credibility in a room full of powerful men. Martha has excellent instincts, Aldrich observed approvingly. That dress will send exactly the right message. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her with an expression that mixed encouragement with something deeper and more personal. Lirelei, he said softly, using her given name despite the formal circumstances. Trust yourself. Trust your intelligence and your instincts. You belong in that room as much as anyone else. An hour later, Lirelei found herself walking through corridors that buzzed with barely controlled activity as news of the crisis spread through the castle. Servants hurried past carrying messages and supplies. Guards stood at heightened alert. And everywhere there was the sense of a kingdom preparing for the possibility of war. The war room was located in the castle's most secure section, accessible only through a series of guarded checkpoints that spoke of the sensitive nature of the discussions held there. As Martha escorted her through the final door, Lirelei felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The chamber itself was dominated by an enormous table carved from a single piece of black oak, its surface covered with detailed maps of the kingdom and surrounding territories. Tall windows offered strategic views of the approaches to the castle, while walls lined with weapons and banners reminded everyone present of the military realities that underlay all political discussions. 4 people were already seated around the table when Lirelei entered, and she felt the weight of their combined attention as they turned to assess the newcomer. These were the most powerful individuals in the kingdom after Aldrich himself, and their first impressions would determine how effectively she could function in her new role. Lord Darius Blackthorne was exactly what she had expected, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance for future analysis. His clothing was expensively simple, and he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions carry significant weight. Lady Cordelia Ashworth was more surprising. Younger than Lirelei had anticipated, perhaps 40, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her dress was elegantly understated, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she was far more dangerous than her refined appearance indicated. Sir Marcus she had already met, and he offered her a respectful nod that she gratefully returned. The final member of the group, Lord Cassius Goldwine, was a thin, nervous-looking man whose fine clothing couldn't quite disguise the calculating nature of his gaze as he evaluated her potential usefulness to his own interests. "Lords and lady," Aldrich said as he entered behind Lirelei, "may I present Lady Lirelei, cousin to Queen Serafina, recently recovered from a lengthy illness and now joining our inner council." The introduction was smoothly done, but Lirelei could see the questions in every face around the table. This was clearly not what any of them had been expecting, and she could practically feel them making mental notes to investigate her background more thoroughly at the earliest opportunity. "Your Majesty," Lord Darius said carefully, "while we welcome Lady Lirelei to court, perhaps such a sensitive council meeting is not the most appropriate introduction to our deliberations." The objection was politely phrased but unmistakably firm. Lirelei felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized that her very first appearance in court was being challenged before she had even spoken a word. "On the contrary, Lord Darius," Aldrich replied coolly, "Lady Lirelei's unique perspective may be exactly what we need. She brings fresh eyes to problems that we may have become too familiar with to see clearly." Lady Cordelia leaned forward slightly, her green eyes studying Lirelei with unsettling intensity. "Forgive my curiosity, my lady, but your recovery from illness seems remarkably complete. You appear to be in excellent health." The probing nature of the question sent alarm bells ringing in Lirelei's mind. This woman clearly suspected something, and any response would need to be carefully calibrated to avoid giving away too much while still maintaining the fiction of her identity. I have been blessed with a full restoration of my strength, Lady Cordelia, she replied with what she hoped was appropriate humility, though I confess the years of illness left me with much to relearn about the world beyond my sick room. And yet His Majesty feels you are prepared to advise on matters of military strategy and kingdom defense. Lord Cassius interjected, his tone suggesting polite skepticism. Before Lirelai could respond, Aldrich's voice cut across the room with unmistakable authority. Lady Lirelai's contributions to this council are not subject to debate, he said firmly. Now, shall we focus on the actual crisis facing our kingdom, or would you prefer to continue questioning my judgment in front of external threats? The rebuke was gently delivered, but absolutely clear. Around the table, the assembled advisors shifted uncomfortably as they recognized that their king's support for this mysterious newcomer was both genuine and non-negotiable. Of course, Your Majesty, Lord Darius said, though his expression suggested the conversation was far from over. Sir Marcus, please brief us on the intelligence regarding Malakar's movements. As the military discussion began in earnest, Lirelai found herself both fascinated and overwhelmed by the complexity of the strategic situation. Maps were unrolled showing troop dispositions and supply lines. Reports were read detailing the magical defenses that had been established along the eastern borders, and estimates were debated regarding the size and capabilities of the enemy force. The Shadow Legion was reduced to perhaps 300 survivors after the Battle of Thornridge 5 years ago, Sir Marcus was explaining, pointing to locations on the detailed map. If they're fielding 200 mounted warriors now, they've either recruited extensively from the wild tribes or they're using darker methods to swell their ranks, Lady Cordelia finished grimly. Malakar was always willing to employ necromancy when conventional tactics failed him. The word sent a chill through the room. Lirelai had read about necromancy in her historical texts, but the clinical descriptions hadn't prepared her for the visceral horror that crossed the faces around the table. What are our options? Aldrich asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the threat being discussed. We could mobilize the eastern garrisons and attempt to engage them before they fully organize, Sir Marcus suggested. Strike fast and hard while they're still gathering strength. That assumes we can locate them in the Darkwood, Lord Darius countered. The terrain favors defenders, and Malakar knows that region better than anyone. We could be walking into a trap. The alternative is waiting for them to complete their preparations and attack at a time of their choosing, Lord Cassius pointed out. From a strategic standpoint, that seems even more dangerous. As the debate continued, Lirelai found herself studying the maps with growing understanding. The geographical features, the trade routes, the placement of settlements and defensive positions, all of it began to form a pattern in her mind, a complex puzzle that her years of strategic reading had prepared her to analyze. May I ask a question? She said quietly, and was surprised when the entire table fell silent. Aldrich nodded encouragingly. Please. These reports of Malakar's movements, they're all from the eastern borders, correct? The Darkwood region, specifically? That's correct, Sir Marcus confirmed. But historically, hasn't Malakar's preferred strategy been misdirection? Using obvious troop movements to mask his real intentions? The question hung in the air as the assembled advisors considered its implications. Lady Cordelia's expression sharpened with what might have been respect. She has a point, the spy master said slowly. During the War of Three Crowns, Malakar repeatedly used feints and false concentrations to draw enemy forces out of position. You're suggesting the Eastern buildup is a distraction, Lord Darius asked, his tone suggesting he was beginning to reassess his initial dismissal of Lirelai's potential value. I'm suggesting we should consider what he might be trying to draw our attention away from, Lirelai replied, her confidence growing as she saw the strategic problem more clearly. Where are our defenses weakest? What objectives might he consider more valuable than a direct assault? Aldrich was watching her with unconcealed admiration, but it was Sir Marcus who supplied the answer that made everyone's blood run cold. The Sunspear Pass, he said grimly. If he could seize the pass, he'd control the main trade route between three kingdoms. And our defenses there are minimal because we've always assumed the eastern approaches were the primary threat. The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. If Malachar could seize and hold the Sunspear Pass, he wouldn't need to conquer kingdoms through direct military action. He could strangle their economies and force them to negotiate from a position of weakness. Lady Liralee, Lord Darius said, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional interest. What would you recommend? The question marked a turning point that Liralee recognized even as she lived it. These powerful, experienced advisors were actually asking for her opinion, treating her insights as valuable rather than dismissing her as an unwelcome intrusion. Send a small, fast force to reinforce the Sunspear Pass immediately, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. But make it look like a routine rotation rather than a response to intelligence. Meanwhile, maintain visible preparations for an Eastern campaign to keep Malachar's attention focused where we want it. A double deception, Lady Cordelia mused approvingly. We appear to be falling for his misdirection while actually countering it. It's risky, Lord Cassius pointed out. If we're wrong about his intentions, we'll have divided our forces and weakened our response to the real threat. If we're right, we save 3 kingdoms from economic collapse, Liralee countered. And if we're wrong, we've still strengthened a critical strategic position. The debate that followed was intense but respectful, with Liralee's initial insights serving as the foundation for a comprehensive strategy that drew on everyone's expertise. As the discussion continued, she found herself contributing more confidently, her theoretical knowledge proving surprisingly applicable to practical military problems. When they finally broke for a midday meal, the atmosphere around the table had completely transformed. Where there had been skepticism and barely concealed hostility, there was now grudging respect and genuine interest in her contributions. An impressive first performance, Lady Cordelia murmured as they filed out of the war room. Though I confess myself curious about the source of your strategic education. Such insights don't develop in isolation. The comment was both compliment and warning, and Liralee understood that her reprieve from scrutiny would be temporary. Eventually, these people would want answers about her background that she couldn't provide without destroying the carefully constructed fiction of her identity. But as she walked beside Aldrich through the castle corridors, seeing the approval in his silver eyes and feeling the satisfaction of having contributed meaningfully to the kingdom's defense, she realized that the risk was worth it. For the first time in her life, she was using her abilities for something that mattered, something that could make a real difference in the world. You exceeded every expectation I had, Aldrich said quietly as they paused outside her chambers. That insight about Malachar's strategy may have saved countless lives. It felt right, she replied, still somewhat amazed by her own boldness. Like all those years of reading military histories finally had a purpose. This is only the beginning, he promised, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. You have a gift, Liralee, a mind that sees patterns others miss. The kingdom has need of such gifts. The kingdom has need of such gifts. The words echoed in her mind as she watched him stride away toward his own duties. But even more powerful was the realization that had been building throughout the day. This wasn't just about serving the kingdom anymore. Somewhere between the tower prison and the war room, between the frightened girl who had never left her chamber and the woman who had just helped plan military strategy, she had discovered something that changed everything. She was falling in love with the Alpha King, and judging by the way he looked at her, the way he valued her opinions and trusted her insights, the feeling might not be entirely one-sided. As she entered her chambers and closed the door behind her, Liralee realized that her greatest challenge wasn't going to be proving herself worthy of a place in this court. It was going to be navigating the treacherous waters of forbidden attraction, political necessity, and the growing certainty that her heart was leading her toward a destination that could destroy everything she had gained and everything she had grown to care about. The morning of Liralee's first day at court dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the magnificent windows of her chamber in the Tower of Stars. She had awakened before dawn, too nervous and excited to sleep, and had spent the early hours reading from one of the philosophy texts Aldrich had given her, seeking wisdom from ancient minds to steady her own tumultuous thoughts. Martha arrived with breakfast in an expression of determined cheerfulness that didn't quite mask her own anxiety. "Today's the day, my lady," she said, setting down a tray laden with delicacies that still seemed impossibly luxurious after 20 years of thin porridge and bread crusts. "Are you ready to take your place in the world?" "I don't think anyone could be ready for such a thing," Lorelei replied, though she managed a smile as she accepted the cup of perfectly brewed tea Martha offered. "But I suppose readiness is less important than courage." "Wise words," came a familiar voice from the doorway. King Aldrich entered without ceremony, already dressed in the formal attire of court, deep blue velvet trimmed with silver, his circlet of office catching the morning light. Yet despite the royal regalia, Lorelei found herself remembering the man who had sat by her fireplace last night, speaking her name like a prayer. "Your Majesty," she said, rising to offer a respectful curtsy that felt strange after their intimate conversation the previous evening. "Today, in formal settings, it must be Your Majesty," he acknowledged, though his silver eyes held warmth that belied the formal address. "But I wanted to speak with you privately before you face the court." Martha, with the instinct of someone who had spent 20 years reading unspoken communications, quietly excused herself to arrange Lorelei's wardrobe for the day. When they were alone, Aldrich moved to the window that offered the best view of the kingdom spread below. "There are things you need to understand about my court," he began without preamble. "Political currents that run beneath the surface of every conversation, alliances and enmities that date back generations." Before he could continue, a commotion in the corridor outside caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and beneath it all, an undercurrent of urgency that spoke of crisis rather than routine business. The knight who burst into the chamber was tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair and scarred hands speaking of decades spent in service to the crown. His face was grim as he dropped to one knee before his king. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but urgent news has arrived from Astroleth." Lorelei's blood ran cold at the mention of her former home. Aldrich's expression sharpened immediately. "Rise, Marcus. What news?" "King Aldwin has discovered Lady Lorelei's departure and is demanding her immediate return. He's threatening to void the marriage alliance if she is not delivered to Astroleth's borders within 7 days." The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Lorelei felt the world tilt around her as she understood the magnitude of what was happening. Her father had not simply accepted her disappearance. He was using it as leverage, threatening the very political foundation that Aldrich's marriage to Seraphina had been meant to secure. "And Queen Seraphina's position?" Aldrich asked, his voice deadly calm. "Unclear, sire. The message came directly from King Aldwin, with no mention of the Queen's involvement or knowledge." When Sir Marcus had departed to carry out his orders for increased border security, Lorelei found herself alone with the Aldrich once more. The intimate atmosphere of the previous evening had been shattered by the cold realities of political consequence. "I have to go back," she said quietly, though the words felt like poison on her tongue. "If I say it destroys everything, the alliance, your marriage, the stability you've worked so hard to build." "No." The single word carried absolute authority. "You are under my protection now, and I don't abandon those who have placed their trust in me." "But the cost will be mine to bear," he interrupted, moving to stand before her. "Lorelei, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his silver gaze, seeing there a determination that both thrilled and terrified her. "In 2 days, you have already proven your worth beyond question. Your insights about trade negotiations, your analysis of the eastern border tensions, your ability to see solutions that elude experienced advisors. This kingdom needs what you can offer." "And your marriage? Your alliance with Astroleth, I asked Leth?" Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability breaking through the mask of royal authority. "My marriage was a political necessity, arranged to benefit both kingdoms. But it was never—" He paused, struggling with words that could reshape the political landscape of 2 realms. "It was never based on anything more than mutual respect and duty." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither dared fully examine. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Instead of answering directly, Aldrich moved to his desk and retrieved a document bearing the royal seal of Shadowmere. 3 hours ago, I signed in this decree. It officially recognizes you as Lady Lyreley of Shadowmere, grants you full citizenship and noble status, and places you under the protection of this crown. Lyreley stared at the document in amazement. You're making me a citizen of Shadowmere? I'm making you untouchable by Astroleth's laws, he corrected. King Aldwin may demand your return, but he has no authority over a recognized noble of another kingdom. Politically, his hands are tied. The brilliance of the maneuver took her breath away. With a single document, Aldrich had transformed her from a hidden prisoner into a protected noble, rendering her father's threats meaningless while maintaining the technical requirements of international law. But this still threatens your marriage alliance, she pointed out. Then perhaps it's time for a different kind of alliance, he said, and the quiet intensity in his voice made her heart race. Before she could ask what he meant, another knock came at the door. This time it was Lady Cordelia Ashworth, the spy master, whose expression was both urgent and oddly satisfied. Your Majesty, my apologies for the interruption, but I have information that changes everything. Speak freely, Cordelia. Lady Lyreley is part of my inner circle now. The spy master's green eyes fixed on Lyreley with an intensity that made her want to step backward. My lady, when I received word of your arrival, I naturally began investigating your background. What I discovered was illuminating. Lyreley felt panic flood her system. If Lady Cordelia had uncovered the truth about her imprisonment, about the prophecy, about everything, I know exactly who you are, the spy master continued with a slight smile, and more importantly, I know what you represent. I don't understand, Lyreley managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. The birthmark on your left shoulder, Lady Cordelia said calmly. It's not just any mark, it's the mark of the Shadow Crane, mentioned in prophecies that predate the founding of both our kingdoms. Aldrich stepped forward, his attention completely focused. Explain. According to texts in our most ancient archives, the mark of the Shadow Crown appears once in every generation on someone destined to unite divided realms through wisdom rather than conquest. Lady Cordelia's expression was almost reverent now. The bearer will be hidden and scorned, tested by adversity, but ultimately recognized as a bridge between worlds that have forgotten how to trust each other. The words hit Lyreley like a revelation. The birthmark that had been used to justify her imprisonment, the curse that had shaped every day of her life, was actually a sign of destiny, not destruction, but unification. You're saying the prophecy that condemned me was misinterpreted? She asked. Deliberately misinterpreted, I suspect, Lady Cordelia replied. There are those who benefit from keeping kingdoms divided, who profit from conflict and mistrust. Recognizing the true meaning of your mark would have threatened their power. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that could reshape the political structure of multiple realms. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Then it's time to stop hiding your light under false names and manufactured shame. He turned to face her directly, and what she saw in his silver eyes made her breath catch. Lyreley of Shadowmere, will you accept the position of Chief Ambassador to the Allied Kingdoms, with full authority to negotiate treaties and resolve conflicts in my name? The offer was staggering in its scope. He was essentially proposing to make her his equal in diplomatic matters, giving her the power to reshape relationships between realms that had been locked in mistrust for generations. But you've spent 20 years studying every aspect of governance, diplomacy, and political theory, he interrupted. You see solutions where others see only problems. Find common ground where others see only division. If anyone can bridge the gaps between our kingdoms, it's you. As she looked into his eyes, Lyreley saw not just professional respect, but something deeper and more dangerous. A love that threatened every political calculation, every carefully constructed alliance, every assumption about duty and desire. And if I accept this position, she said carefully, what happens to your marriage? Queen Seraphina and I have had several very honest conversations since your departure from Astroleth, he replied with a slight smile. She has informed me that while she values our political alliance, She has no desire to remain in a marriage that prevents both of us from finding genuine happiness. Literally felt the world shift around her as she understood what he was telling her. She's agreed to an annulment. She's insisting on it, he said with obvious affection for his soon-to-be former wife. Apparently, she's fallen rather dramatically in love with Sir Garrett of the Western Marches, and maintaining our political marriage was preventing her from pursuing that relationship. The revelation was so unexpected that Lyrelay found herself laughing despite the gravity of the situation. Sarah's in love. Apparently, love has been breaking out all over, Aldrich said, his silver eyes holding hers with unmistakable meaning. Before she could respond, Martha burst into the chamber with an expression of barely contained excitement. My lady, your majesty, a messenger has arrived from Queen Seraphina herself. The messenger, a young woman in Astroleth's colors, delivered her message with obvious pleasure. Your majesties, Queen Seraphina sends word that King Aldwin has agreed to recognize the annulment of the royal marriage in exchange for a new trade agreement that will benefit both kingdoms significantly. She also wishes Lady Lyrelay to know that their father's threats were made without the Queen's knowledge or approval, and that she stands ready to testify to Lady Lyrelay's noble character before any court in any kingdom. When the messenger had been dismissed with generous compensation for her swift journey, Lyrelay found herself alone with Aldrich once more. But now the air between them crackled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before. So, she said, hardly daring to believe what was happening, your marriage will be annulled. I'm officially a noble of Shadowmere, and my sister supports whatever choice I make about my future. It appears so, he agreed, moving closer until she could see the flecks of darker silver in his eyes. And you're offering me a position that would make me one of the most powerful diplomats in the known world. I am. Why? She asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Instead of responding with words, Aldrich reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the line of her cheekbones. Because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Because your mind amazes me every day. Because when I look at you, I see not just who you are, but who you could become if given the chance to shine. And, she whispered, leaning into his touch. And because I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with you, he said simply. Not with a political alliance or a strategic advantage, but with the woman who spent 20 years in darkness and emerged with enough light to illuminate kingdoms. The kiss that followed was inevitable, gentle at first but deepening as 20 years of isolation and loneliness met genuine love and acceptance. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Lyrelay felt as though she had been fundamentally transformed by the simple act of being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Is that a yes to my proposal? He asked with a smile that made him look years younger. Which proposal? She teased. The diplomatic position or the rather obvious romantic one? Both, I hope. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. The work, the challenge, the love, the future we could build together. The months that followed were a whirlwind of transformation that exceeded Lyrelay's wildest dreams. Her first diplomatic mission, negotiating a three-way trade agreement between Shadowmere, Astroleth, and the maritime kingdom of Coral Bay, was such a stunning success that requests for her services began pouring in from across the known world. The key to her effectiveness lay in something her years of imprisonment had taught her. How to listen not just to what people said, but to what they couldn't bring themselves to say. How to find the human needs beneath political posturing, the common ground beneath apparently irreconcilable differences. Within 6 months, she had resolved territorial disputes that had festered for decades, established trade relationships that brought prosperity to previously isolated regions, and earned a reputation as the diplomat who could work miracles through understanding rather than intimidation. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when King Aldwin himself requested her services to mediate a border conflict with a neighboring realm. The father who had imprisoned her for 20 years was now asking for her help, and she provided it with grace and efficiency that left him speechless with admiration and shame. I was wrong about you, he admitted during their private meeting after the successful negotiations. I was so afraid of what you might become that I never allowed myself to see what you actually were. "You were afraid," she replied with hard-won compassion. "Fear makes us do terrible things to the people we should protect." Her wedding to Aldrich was a celebration that lasted 3 days and drew guests from 7 kingdoms. Seraphina served as her matron of honor, radiant with her own happiness as the wife of Sir Garrett. The ceremony was held in the same courtyard where Lirelei had first glimpsed her future husband from her tower window. And as they exchanged vows, she thought of how impossible this moment would have seemed to the frightened girl who had pressed her face against prison bars for 20 years. Martha, dressed in silk and wearing the gold chain of the royal household mistress, wept openly throughout the ceremony. Lady Cordelia had discovered documents proving that Martha had repeatedly petitioned for Lyrelei's better treatment over the years, requests that had been ignored or dismissed. The revelation had earned the elderly woman not just respect, but a position of genuine authority in her new home. But it was the moment when Aldrich slipped the wedding ring onto her finger that truly marked Lyrelei's transformation from shadow to light. The ring bore an inscription in the ancient tongue: "From darkness to dawn, from silence to song, from prisoner to queen." "Queen?" she had asked when she first read the inscription. "Not yet," Aldrich had replied with a mysterious smile. "But someday when we're both ready, when the kingdom is ready, someday you'll wear a crown of your own making, rather than one inherited through accident of birth." As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Lirelei often found herself in the observatory at the top of the Tower of Stars, looking out over a kingdom that had become truly hers through choice rather than blood. The view from this tower was so different from the one she had known for 20 years. Not a window onto a world she couldn't join, but a vantage point from which she could see the effects of her work spreading across the realm and beyond. The prophecy had been right, she realized. The Shadow Twin had indeed brought change to the crown, not through destruction, but through the kind of transformation that could only come from someone who had experienced both the depths of injustice and the heights of redemption. And when Aldrich joined her in the observatory, as he did most evenings, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Lirelei understood that she had found something rarer than political success or public recognition. She had found her place in the world, and more precious still, she had found someone who valued not just what she could do, but who she was: shadows and light, pain and wisdom, the frightened girl she had been, and the remarkable woman she had become. "Any regrets?" Aldrich asked one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Only one," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "What's that?" "That I wasted so many years believing I was worthless, when I should have been preparing for the moment when someone would finally see my worth." "Then we'll make sure no other child ever has to learn that lesson," he said, and in his silver eyes she saw the future they would build together. A kingdom where worth was measured by wisdom rather than birth, where shadows were valued as much as light, where every person would have the chance to discover their own unique form of greatness. The Shadow Twin was gone forever, transformed into something unprecedented. A queen of her own making, a bridge between worlds. A woman who had taken 20 years of darkness and transformed it into light that could illuminate entire kingdoms. And in the tower that had once been her prison, now transformed into her sanctuary, Lirelei smiled as she contemplated the magnificent impossibility bound of a life reclaimed, a love discovered, and a destiny fulfilled beyond her wildest dreams. The Alpha King had indeed seen what no one else could see. But perhaps more importantly, he had helped her learn to see it in herself.